Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for what might be our most ambitious journey yet.
I think you might be right.
We're tackling the Unified Coherence Theory, or UCTE. I mean, this thing is huge, a really complex theoretical framework. It doesn't just try to unify physics. It actually attempts to fundamentally redefine the nature of reality itself. We're aiming for a truly comprehensive look at the sources today.
Yeah, it's arguably one of the most, demanding papers we've ever encountered. It jumps, seamlessly from nonlinear topology straight into cosmology, sometimes in the very same sentence.
Right. So our mission today, for you listening, is to give you that critical shortcut, the sort of conceptual key to unlock this really revolutionary work.
Exactly. We're going to break down the philosophy, the heavy math involved, and the cosmology into these essential nuggets you can hopefully grasp and, use right away.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. We should jump right into the central claim because it's a radical departure from pretty much everything we're taught about the universe.
It really is.
The UCTE basically suggests that the universe, its geometry, and all its physical laws, they all emerge from modulations, from changes, in a single fundamental pre-geometric field. And this field is simply called coherence, symbolized by math caldeo.
And what's just fascinating here is the sheer inversion of classical thought, especially when you think about general relativity. Traditionally, we start with space-time as a kind of container.
Right, like a stage.
Exactly, a stage. And within that container, matter causes curvature. It's Einstein's famous line, right? Mass tells space how to curve.
The UCTE just flips that completely on its head. It basically inverts the axiom to say something like, coherence variation tells hypergravity how to project curvature. So UCTE is arguing that spacetime isn't fundamental at all. It's the result of variations in this underlying coherence field.
Yeah.
The whole structure of the universe is built entirely on the shifting dynamics of this math called B.
Which means we're dealing with a framework where things like matter, energy, geometry, they're all secondary effects. The primary reality is this state of perfect, infinite, pre-geometric coherence.
Yeah. Right.
So understanding how that coherence field breaks, how it changes to create the measurable universe, that's the entire focus of this deep dive. Hopefully you'll walk away with those crucial aha moments about how this unified theory constructs everything from mathematics to matter.
Right. So if coherence is the fundamental fabric, we absolutely have to start at the beginning. What is this state of perfect, unmodulated coherence? The theory calls it hypergravity invariance. What does that actually mean?
It means pure symmetry. Think of it like a state of absolute unity before any distinction exists. And critically, because it's pre-geometric, there are no distinguishable directions, no distances.
So no differences at all?
No differences whatsoever. If there's no difference between point A and point B, you literally cannot define the space between them. It's just the perfect self-identity of the field itself.
And this perfect featureless state, that's exactly what the universe starts to depart from. And that's where geometry is born. This brings us straight to axiom 1. Curvature, math Keller, isn't an intrinsic property of space.
Right.
But it's the geometric manifestation of reduced coherence, lost coherence, essentially.
Exactly. When that perfect symmetry, that hypergravity invariance is just slightly modulated, tiny infinitesimal differences arise between, let's say, local coherence vectors. This instability, this deviation from pure self-identity, that's what we end up measuring as geometry. The source material calls this departure quite profound.
The philosophical angle is really powerful, too. Curvature is described as the first gesture of becoming. It's like the universe's minimal step away from perfect unity. The moment begins to become something, differentiated and visible.
And formally, this is captured by that relationship, propto novelum mathical. So curvature is proportional to the negative gradient in coherence.
Okay, the gradient, like a slope.
Yeah, like a change across space, or rather across the field. So if you have a change in coherence, you must, by definition, generate curvature. This basically reframes general relativity. It's not really a theory of gravity anymore, but a theory of coherence reduction.
Ah, okay.
Coherence reduction produces a local distortion, right? And that distortion appears to us as curvature within the emergent space-time layer that comes later.
I think I need a visualization for that. If the field is like perfectly flat water, what's the coherence gradient in that picture?
Okay, good analogy. Think of that perfectly flat water as the state of hypergravity invariance. Cure potential. A coherence gradient, a nobla math call, is the moment you drop a single, absolutely infinitesimal pebble into that water.
Just the tiniest ripple.
Not even the ripple yet. It's the initial disturbance, the cause of the ripple. That minimal disturbance is the first gesture of becoming. That gradient immediately forces the field to react, and that reaction follows a very precise order the paper calls the causal cascade of emergence.
Okay, let's detail that cascade. How does that single tiny difference translate into a whole measurable geometric universe?
Right. So the cascade moves from that sort of conceptual difference to actual physical structure. It goes like this. First, you have the coherence gradient. The pebble hits. A slight asymmetry forms, and that seeds the requirement for geometry. Something has changed.
Okay, step one.
Step 2 is torsion. This initial gradient causes a twisting of the local coherence vectors. It generates rotational asymmetry. This is like the formation of the first actual ripple, but it's a twisting motion, a kind of resistance to the change.
A twist. Interesting, not just a bump.
Exactly, a twist. Then third comes curvature. Curvature is produced basically by integrating this torsion along paths. The ripples, the twists become integrated bends in the fabric of the surface, so to speak.
Okay, so curvature comes after torsion.
Yes. And finally, fourth, you get chirality. This is the directional stabilization of this resonance, which leads to the emergence of spinors, determining the physical handedness or polarity in the derived layer we actually observe.
Wow, okay. So curvature is fundamentally a secondary effect. It's downstream of torsion, which is itself downstream of a coherence gradient. It's like a chain reaction triggered simply by a loss of that perfect symmetry.
Precisely.
But let's stick on torsion for a second. In standard physics, torsion is, well, it's often ignored, right? Or treated as just a geometrical curiosity, a measure of twist in spacetime. But UCTE really elevates it.
It elevates it completely. Torsion isn't just some mathematical twist in this model. UCTE defines it as the rotational modulation of coherence, and crucially, it equates this twist with resonance.
Resonance, like a vibration.
Exactly. Torsion is therefore the sustained oscillatory self-relation of the coherence field. It's how the field interacts with itself dynamically.
Okay, that makes torsion not some kind of defect in geometry, but the very mechanism of life and dynamism in the universe.
That's exactly the implication. Torsion is the living breath of coherence, the energetic mode through which the invariant static field becomes dynamic and active. It's the necessary bridge connecting that ultimate pre-geometric reality, hypergravity invariance, to the active vibrational geometry we can actually observe.
So without torsion, without this resonance.
The field would just be a static math-called dollar unity. Perfect oneness, but with no measurable properties. Nothing would happen. The theory even goes so far as to suggest that problems like, dark matter and dark energy, they might just be misidentified coherence effects.
You mean they aren't stuff at all?
Well, they're not separate exotic particles or fields in this view. They could be the lingering large-scale effects of unintegrated torsion and the scalar coherence potential itself. The energy stored in the field structure, not in extra matter.
That's a huge claim. Okay,
Yeah.
We absolutely must transition now to the mathematical core, the universal field tensor, or UFT formalism.
Right, the equations.
For you listening, we know the appearance of these equations can look pretty daunting, but we promise we'll distill the conceptual meaning of these four core equations. They're like the algebraic engine that gives the coherence engine its physical rules.
Yeah, and we can think of these four equations not just as abstract math, but more like the field's operating manual. They define how geometry is built, how it interacts with energy, how it evolves over time, and how its fundamental properties are conserved.
Why four equations, though?
Well, you need four because the UCTE has to account for both the scalar potential of coherence, the sort of smooth changes, and the dynamic rotational component, which is the torsion, symbolized by $dollars. You need equations for both aspects.
Got it. Okay, let's start with the biggest, maybe most complex looking one, equation 4. The source calls it the curvature generation engine. Now, in general relativity, curvature, the Ricci tensor, is sourced purely by mass and momentum, the stress-energy tensor. What sources it here in UCTE?
Okay, equation 4 explicitly defines how this Ricci curvature is generated, and it shows that curvature arises from two main sources that are not conventional mass energy. These sources are contained in what the paper calls the alpha block and the beta block.
Alpha and beta blocks.
Right. They basically represent the two fundamental ways the coherence field can be inhomogeneous or, deviate from perfect uniformity.
Can you break down the difference between those two blocks conceptually? What do they feel like?
Sure. The alpha block represents the smooth, non-rotational bending of space, or rather the coherence field manifesting as space. It's sourced by those scalar coherence gradients we talked about, specifically terms involving the logarithm of the coherence potential from this math-cal. Picture a vast, smooth, gentle hill in the geometric landscape.
Okay, large-scale, gentle curves.
Exactly. This is coherence just increasing or decreasing smoothly across a large area. This explains things like large-scale, static curvature in the universe.
And a beta block.
Yeah.
Sounds more active.
The beta block is entirely different. It represents the rotational twist, and it's sourced by the coherence torsion. This isn't a smooth hill. This is more like a rapid, localized vortex or a sustained twist in the field.
Like tiny whirlpools.
Sort of, yeah. And the theory asserts this rotational twist, this torsion component, is what generates many of the measurable quantum effects we see. It directly links the small-scale quantum dynamics to the larger geometric field. So the conceptual link here is that curvature is generated not by the material stuff floating in space,
Right.
but by the inherent twists, that's the beta block, and bends, the alpha block, of the coherence field itself as it departs from perfect invariance.
Which makes perfect sense within the framework. If coherence is perfectly uniform, math-cal is constant, then nabla is 0, torsion dollars would be 0, so the alpha and beta blocks disappear, and space is flat. Rate goes to 0.
Exactly. No change, no curvature.
Okay. Now, equation 7, the coherence-sourced Einstein relation. You said this is where the unification really hits, balancing geometry and energy.
Yes, this equation reformulates the standard Einstein field equations, the Einstein tensor, representing geometry, as a required balance between that geometry and all forms of energy content. So geometry on one side is balanced by 3 forms of content on the other side, which collectively make up the generalized energy momentum tensor.
3 forms, what are they?
First, you have conventional matter, the usual stuff, text matter. Second, you have the energy stored in the scalar coherence field itself. And third, you have the energy stored in the torsional part of the field.
I have to stop you there. This seems to directly confront the whole missing mass problem in cosmology, right? Dark matter. If the geometry we observe is bending more than the visible matter can account for, traditional physics says there must be invisible dark matter. What does UCTE say is causing that extra bending?
This is really one of the most elegant parts of the UCTE approach, I think. It asserts that the missing energy, what we currently label as dark energy and dark matter, isn't some exotic, unknown type of mass particle.
It's what?
It's simply the energy contained in those other 2 terms. The scalar coherence energy TM, the torsional energy tab, the geometry is bending because of the massive distributed energy that's already stored inherently in the background coherence field and its rotational torsion structure. These fields are real, they have energy, but they are not matter in the conventional sense.
Wow. So dark matter and dark energy are just unseen aspects of the coherence field's own energy density and twist.
That's the proposition.
Oh.
It potentially resolves those cosmological puzzles without needing new particles.
That really makes matter and curvature just interchangeable manifestations of how the coherence field is modulated. Equation 7 defines the channels for energy exchange, and the universe is constantly balancing its geometry against these 3 faces of energy matter, scalar coherence, torsional coherence, all rooted in the single field math-cal.
Precisely. It's a dynamic equilibrium.
Okay, moving on to equation 9. This one governs the dynamics of the field itself, the engine.
Yes, this is the engine. It's the equation of motion specifically for the logarithmic coherence potential, which they define as phi ln all a, and it turns out to be a nonlinear wave-like equation, and it describes the field's natural tendency to restore balance when it's disturbed.
How so?
Well, if the coherence field gets twisted or bent somehow, if phi changes this equation, shows how the field actively fights back, trying to return to equilibrium, to that state of minimum energy, minimum disturbance.
The source calls this the coherence engine. What's the big cosmological implication of that?
It implies there's a hidden regulator of order behind literally all natural and cosmic processes. It defines the fundamental dynamics of the universe.
Yeah.
And the implication is profound. The field is constantly striving to return to that curvatureless state of perfect invariance. The equation includes a potential term, $5. When the coherence potential is stationary, meaning $5, the field is at its minimum energy state, and curvature vanishes. The engine is always driving the system back toward full coherence and minimum geometric complexity towards flatness.
So the inherent drive of the universe, mathematically speaking, according to this theory, is to flatten itself out, to return to unity.
In a sense, yes. It's a drive towards equilibrium, which in this framework is flatness and perfect coherence.
Okay, one more equation in this formalism, equation 10, the coherence torsion conservation. Why is a conservation law needed specifically for torsion, for the twist?
This is really critical for the theory's ontological claim, its claim about the fundamental nature of being. It's a conservation law for the torsion field dollars, and it's written mathematically as $H equals 0.
What does that mean in plain English?
It means that the flux of coherence twist is divergence-free. Think of it like magnetic field lines. They always form closed loops. They don't start or stop anywhere. Similarly, torsion cannot be created from absolutely nothing, nor can it be destroyed into nothing. It can only be redistributed or transformed throughout the field.
Ah, so the twistiness of the universe is conserved.
Exactly. This expresses the eternality and conservative nature of the omnilectic field, the underlying invariant backdrop of all being. The twist, the resonance, is a fundamental conserved property of the underlying reality. It ensures that the field's dynamics are sort of contained and self-referential.
And what does that imply for physical systems?
It means that any observable physical system, like a particle, must conserve the torsion that was imparted to it by the coherence field when it formed. This could be linked to conserved quantities like spin or charge in particle physics. The twist has to go somewhere.
Okay, this mathematical framework is dense, but conceptually powerful. It paints a picture of a universe governed by the ebb and flow of coherence and its twist.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, the UCTE also defines a four-tiered ontological structure, like layers of reality, to map this journey from pure potential down to our messy observed world. And it's vital to keep remembering, as you said, that geometry in this model isn't a passive container.
No, not at all.
It is the actively constructed universe itself.
Right. And we can trace what the paper calls the descent of being through these 4 layers. Think of them as sequential stages of coherence differentiation, moving away from perfect unity. First, you have the omnilectic layer. This is pure potential, the state of, let's call it mathematical invariance. It's the pre-geometric unity. The field is sort of unaware of itself. No dimensions, no distances, just infinite capacity. This is like the zero potential in that cosmological seed equation analogy we'll get to later.
Okay, the absolute source, layer 1.
Layer 2 is the hololectic layer. Here, the first differentiation occurs. Those gradients and torsion appear. The field begins to construct itself, to define relationships within itself. This is where universal geometry is actually born to it. The rules of geometry emerge, but the structure is still highly unified, not yet what we'd call dynamic spacetime.
So geometry forms before spacetime.
Yes. Then, layer 3 is the relational layer. This is dynamic geometry. This is where the geometric field stabilizes into the interacting space-time fabric we generally observe. Interaction begins here, driven by that coherence engine, equation 9. This is the constructed universe of observable interactions, where symmetry starts to break down into observed relationships.
This sounds like the realm of classical physics and relativity.
Largely, yes. And finally, layer 4 is the derived layer. This is our perceived physical reality. It's the projection we observe, filtered through the inherent asymmetry of observation itself. This is where observers like us perceive discrete forms, matter, particles, and linear time. It's also where the geometric twist, the torsion, manifests most clearly as things like quantum spin and charges.
Okay, so 4 layers: omnilectic, pure potential, hololectic geometry born, relational dynamic geometry spacetime, and derived observed reality.
Exactly. It maps the journey from undifferentiated unity to perceived multiplicity.
And the core insight, worth repeating again, is geometry precedes space. Geometry is the active code, the structure of coherence, and space is just the visible dynamic projection that appears when this geometry stabilizes and starts interacting. The universe isn't in geometry, it is geometry.
And this unification is meant to be total. The assertion is that there's only one unified geometry which acts as the source and the substrate of absolutely everything. And this is where the traditional boundaries between scientific disciplines really start to dissolve.
Okay, let's really elaborate on that unification across disciplines.
Yeah.
How can this single manifold possibly account for, say, the 4 fundamental forces of physics and things like chemistry or even consciousness?
Well, in physics, general relativity already treats gravity as geometry, right? The curvature of space-time.
Right.
The other 3 forces, the gauge fields, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, are typically handled in quantum field theory as curvatures in internal abstract mathematical spaces, not physical space-time. In UCTE, this separation vanishes. The geometric curvature of external space, gravity, and the internal gauge curvature, other forces, are seen as just continuous local aspects of that single underlying coherent manifold. They aren't fundamentally different things.
So quantum mechanics isn't separate either, it's also geometry.
In this view, no, it's not separate. Quantum mechanics appears as the quantized vibrations or resonances of that manifold. Think of particle wave duality, for instance. UCTE suggests it isn't a deep paradox, but simply the manifestation of the coherence field switching its state locally. Sometimes it behaves like localized geometric torsion, which looks like a particle, other times like a delocalized scalar gradient, which looks like a wave.
So every law of physics is just a local rule describing how the coherence geometry behaves. All fields are just sustained patterns within that geometry.
That's the idea. It aims for a complete geometric unification of physics.
But then the theory goes beyond physics. Because if coherence describes organization and information flow, the same geometry must logically govern living systems too. Does the theory explicitly address biology?
It does, quite directly. It argues that the unified geometry underlies chemistry, biology, and even consciousness. In biology, for example, cells and whole organisms are described as highly specialized coherence engines.
Coherence engines, like equation 9.
Similar principle, but localized and functional. They maintain a high degree of internal coherence, effectively resisting the generalized cosmic tendency towards disorder or maximum entropy. They do this by generating and maintaining complex, ordered geometric structures, think proteins, DNA. Life, in this view, is essentially local coherence maximization fighting against the second law of thermodynamics, using geometric structure to do it.
And consciousness. That seems like the biggest leap.
It's framed as the ultimate resonance field. It's seen as the ability of the coherence field within certain complex systems like brains to become aware of its own differentiation, its own patterns. The theory suggests consciousness arises from very high amplitude, sustained coherence resonance patterns, probably occurring in the relational layer, which we then experience subjectively in the derived layer.
Okay, this really drives home that philosophical conclusion you mentioned. The universe does not have geometry. It is geometry, alive with coherence. We aren't just observers standing outside looking at the geometric structure. We are dynamic, highly organized geometric patterns ourselves, actively participating in the field's own unfolding and perhaps its quest for realization.
Exactly. We're part of the geometric process.
This is incredibly deep. We now need to plunge even deeper, beneath geometry itself. If those 4 layers define the structure of reality, the paper talks about something called the Finsler Coherence Hyperfractal Phase Topology, or FCHP topology. This sounds like the substrate that makes geometry possible in the first place.
That's right. FCHP topology is presented as the pure topological framework. It's what defines order and connection before any concept of metrics like distance or time intervals even exist. The order of precedence is very clear in the paper. FCHP topology leads to geometry, which then leads to observable spacetime.
So geometry is, like you said, just the visible skin of this deeper, invisible topological coherence field. FCHP describes how coherence organizes itself before we can even draw a straight line or measure an angle.
Precisely. Standard topology studies things like continuity, connectedness, boundaries. But FCHP has to study the continuity of coherence intensities, differential states of what it calls hyperfractal resonance. And crucially, FCHP employs a Finsler structure.
Finsler? What's different about that?
In standard Euclidean or even Riemannian geometry, direction is kind of fixed and simple. In Finsler geometry, the metric, the way you measure distance, can depend on the direction of travel. UCTE takes this idea and generalizes it significantly. It defines direction not just spatially, but as phase, the resonance orientation of the coherence flow itself.
Phase, like the phase of a wave.
Similar concept, yes. How the coherence is oriented in its resonance. Geometry then appears when these coherence phases become misaligned or decoherent relative to each other, creating gradients and torsion, which manifest as curvature. So geometry is fundamentally phase decoherence made visible.
So the theory needs Finsler geometry because it has to allow directionality itself to be an emergent property of how the coherence is flowing and resonating, not some fixed background property of an empty stage.
Exactly right. And the hyperfractal aspect is just as essential, particularly for explaining scale, because FCHP is described as hyperfractal, meaning it has infinite structural detail at every scale, like a perfect mathematical fractal.
Like the Mandelbrot set or something.
Kind of, but applied to the fabric of potential reality. This hyperfractal nature means that dimensionality itself is emergent rather than being fixed. This contrasts sharply with other theories like string theory or Kaluza-Klein models, which usually have to postulate a fixed number of hidden curled-up dimensions from the start.
So what determines the 3 plus 1 dimensions we actually observe then if it's not fixed?
Dimension, in UCTE, is simply an emergent count of the number of independent resonance directions or phases that stabilize within the coherence field. At the pure omnilectic state, where MathCal represents pure potential, you essentially have undefined dimensionality, infinite hyperdimensional potential, maybe symbolized as MathCal inch dE.
Yeah.
As coherence, gradients, and resonance begin to crystallize through that causal cascade we discussed,
Right, the gradient, torsion, curvature.
the dimension locks into the observed 3 plus 1 structure. But that familiar structure is always resting upon and emerging from this infinitely recursive hyperfractal base. It's not the fundamental reality, just the stable, resonant pattern we perceive.
This level of complexity suggests we need some pretty sophisticated tools to translate between these incredibly abstract topological domains and the measurable geometric ones we see. And that seems to be where the Noetherian Finsler numbers, or NFNs, come in. Why do we need another set of mathematical objects beyond the UFT equations we already talked about?
It's a good question. The UFT equations, remember, describe the dynamics of the geometry, how it changes and interacts. The NFNs, on the other hand, are needed to describe the conservation laws that allow for stable existence and consistent translation across the different layers of reality: omnilectic, hololectic, relational, derived. The paper describes NFNs as the coherence eigenvalues of mathematics itself.
Coherence eigenvalues of math. Okay, what does that mean?
It means they act as the required unifying bridge connecting topology, pure relationships, geometry, structure and shape, and space-time, dynamics, and measurement. They are, in essence, the algebraic fingerprints of the field's fundamental conservation laws. They ensure that the underlying coherence represented in the omnilectic layer can translate consistently into stable particles and interactions in the derived layer.
So they function like quantization operators.
Yeah.
They take the continuous topological potential and chunk it into measurable geometric and dynamic properties.
That's a great way to think about it. They translate abstract topological continuity, pure potential, into measurable geometric fields, things like resonance frequency, torsion magnitude, curvature values, and then further translate those into observable dynamics like motion, charge, spin. They essentially regulate the metric evolution coefficients, the factors that determine how the local geometry of the field actually manifests as observable physical time and space intervals for an observer.
That is a remarkably deep and powerful claim about the nature of mathematics itself, what activates these NFNs, and what defines their specific role at any given layer of reality. Are they always the same?
They are described as being latent, sort of dormant potential numbers, until they are activated by what the paper calls the Four-Tuple activation principle. This principle involves 4 fundamental aspects, symbolized as mathically, hi-fi, sigma, which dictate the domain and manner in which the NFNs operate. First, symmetry. At the most fundamental topological level, this aspect activates NFNs related to conservation laws and invariance. It ensures the underlying unity and self-consistency of the omnilectic source.
Okay, conservation.
Second, asymmetry. This is the crucial driver of change and transformation. It activates NFNs related to resonance gradients, enabling emergence, motion, complexity, think particle creation or evolution. Without asymmetry, nothing happens.
The gesture of becoming.
Exactly. Third, phase. This relates to the directional orientation we discussed with Finsler geometry. It activates NFNs that give rise to torsion, helicity, and chirality, ensuring that when objects emerge and move, they follow defined geometric paths with specific orientations.
Direction.
And fourth, scale. This is the final trigger, the one that determines the dimensional context. It sets the dimensional resonance level. It dictates whether the activated NFNs are governing purely topological relationships, like in the hololectic layer, geometric curvature, relational layer, or fully dynamic space-time evolution with measurable quantities, derived layer.
Wow. So the NFNs, activated by this four-tuple, effectively unify the entire mathematical continuum needed to describe reality. They adapt their function based on the layer, moving from encoding pure symmetry and topology to defining dynamic evolution constants in the observable universe we experience. They're like the field's internal, adaptable programming language.
That's a very good analogy. They provide the consistent rules for translation across the ontological layers.
Okay, let's now move from the specific mechanics of geometry and mathematics to the grand cosmic vision presented by UCTE. The theory provides a complete Genesis narrative, starting with a really profound mathematical analogy, what it calls a seed equation, 0, 10.
Yes, this mathematical identity, 7 and 1 off, provides a kind of algebraic narrative for cosmic genesis. It's meant to encapsulate the entire transition from the absolute potential of the homilectic source to the fully realized, unified, existing universe. But it's crucial, as the paper stresses, to treat the 0 and the 1 here not just as numbers, but as fundamental ontological states.
Okay, so if 0 represents pure potential, what exactly is the meaning of the 0 in this analogy?
The 0 represents the homilectic field itself. It is the state of hyperdimensional potential where, effectively, measurable difference or coherence is 0. But crucially, it's not nothingness or absence of existence. It's infinite capacity, infinite potential to generate form, completely undefined dimensionality, but total potentiality. It represents the state before that first gesture of becoming.
Got it. Pure potential, not emptiness. Then the tower, the recursive exponentiation part, it must represent the actual act of creation itself.
Exactly. The tower symbolizes recursive self-reference. Mathematically, Saylor is often considered indeterminate or undefined. But here, UCTE interprets that very indeterminacy as the source of determination. This infinite recursion, Saylor acting upon nullers acting upon Saylors, is seen as analogous to the internal torsion or self-interaction within the homilectic field that produces the very first infinitesimal coherence differential. It's the engine of becoming, the field perpetually cycling through its own potential to define itself, to create difference from uniformity.
So the recursion is the creation process, and the final convergence to 1.
The 1 represents the fully realized coherence and the achieved ontological unity of the constructed universe. It signifies the state of maximum realized being, the state where a potential has fully actualized into a coherent, unified structure. So the equation provides the entire narrative arc, from the infinite recursive potential of the 0 state, generating differentiation through self-reference, and ultimately converging into coherent oneness. It's the mathematical genesis of measure, structure, and meaning.
That's quite an image. And that brings us to the ultimate cosmological structure proposed, the coherent cycle, which the paper also refers to as cosmic respiration. This sounds like a closed, twofold cycle describing the universe's continuous existence and maybe even its purpose.
Yes, this is really the summation of the 4 layers we discussed earlier, but integrated into 2 continuous, opposing, but complementary movements that describe the entire life cycle of the cosmos. First, there's the descent of being, creation. This is the process of differentiation we've been talking about. Coherence moves away from the pure omnilectic source, cascading down through the geometric layers, holectic, relational, ultimately creating the derived world of discrete forms, matter, energy, and what we perceive as linear time. It's the explosion of potential into manifest complexity. You can think of it as the universe breathing out.
Okay, potential becoming actual. Differentiation.
Then second, there's the ascent of consciousness, realization. This is presented as the counter movement, perhaps even the driving force or goal of the entire system. Consciousness, having arisen within the derived world, as those complex coherence engines we discussed, begins a journey of reunification. It seeks to integrate the differentiated field, to understand its interconnectedness, effectively dissolving distinctions and returning the gathered information, the experience, the resolved nabla that created it, back towards the omnilectic source. This is the universe breathing in.
So the cycle is only truly completed when consciousness realizes its own source in pure coherence, effectively reversing the creative cascade, bringing the 1 back towards the potential of the 0, but now enriched with experience.
That seems to be the implication. And the final conclusion of this cosmology, weaving it all together, is that being and knowing are revealed as a single, continuous, hyperfractal process of differentiation and reunification. The universe isn't just winding down entropically towards a heat death in this model. It's continually creating form, the descent, and then actively seeking to dissolve that form back into unity through awareness and understanding, the ascent.
And the coherence engine, equation 9, where does that fit?
The coherence engine equation 9 is simply the underlying mathematical mechanism ensuring this cycle continues. It constantly pushes the system physically towards its lowest geometric energy state, flatness, unity, while simultaneously using the energy potential released during the descent to drive the emergence and evolution of conscious realization during the ascent. The drive towards flatness fuels the drive towards awareness.
This has been a truly monumental deep dive into the UCTE. I mean, it's an absolute architectural achievement in theoretical cosmology, whether one agrees with all its premises or not. Let's try to quickly summarize those biggest aha moments for everyone listening. First, remember that geometry is not passive.
Absolutely. Curvature isn't caused by mass in some container. It is the geometric expression of lost coherence, derived directly from a negative gradient in the fundamental field. Change in coherence is curvature.
Second, the universe doesn't have geometry, it is geometry. All of physics and science, gravity, quantum mechanics, potentially even biology and consciousness are unified as just continuous aspects or different resonant modes of that single underlying coherent manifold.
Right. Third, mathematics itself is unified through this lens. Those Noetherian Finsler numbers, NFNs, act as universal translators, converting topological continuity into geometric structure, governed by that four-tuple math-cal sigma, which activates coherence appropriately across all scales and layers of reality.
And finally, the entire cosmic architecture is framed by this dynamic coherence cycle. The descent of being, creation, differentiation, inevitably followed by the ascent of consciousness, realization, reunification, perpetually driven by the field's own internal self-regulating mechanism, the coherence engine.
Which brings us right back to our final provocative thought for you to take away. It links the ultimate philosophical or spiritual goal described in the theory back to the hard mathematics we discussed earlier. The theory explicitly notes that in certain contemplative traditions, like the Dzogchen idea of Dzogchen realization, which signifies a state of pure presence, direct, non-dual awareness, this state mathematically corresponds precisely to the condition where coherence is absolute, meaning all gradients and torsion have resolved, and thus curvature, math color, is gable a low, which is, well, $9, not yet. Zero curvature.
Okay, so ultimate realization equals mathematical flatness in this model. And if the coherence engine, equation 9, is fundamentally and mathematically driving the entire system towards that state where curvature vanishes, which is also defined as the state of ultimate realization.
Then the really big question the theory leaves you with is this. If true realization is mathematically equivalent to curvatureless consciousness, does the ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose of the universe's consciousness engine actually lie in flattening its own geometry? Is our awareness, our journey towards understanding and unity, the universe's own tool for completing the cycle and restoring the perfect symmetry it lost in the very act of creation?
A profoundly deep concept to ponder as you continue to explore this subject. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the unified coherence theory.
Yeah, keep digging, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.